It's going well. Nice to talk to you again.
Likewise.
We will introduce ourselves. I'm Mark Schmitt. I'm now introducing myself differently. I'm the former executive editor of the American Prospect, currently sitting in my dining room here.
And I'm Lowry, and I edit National Review magazine.
So we're no longer peers.
I don't even have a dining room, Mark.
Oh, okay.
I live in New York.
I know you live in New York, but that makes you more
yet.
fortunate than in certain ways. Anyway, I just before we started this, I saw the news that I guess it's not official, but several sources are saying that Senator Jim Webb is not going to run for re-election, which to me is there's something significant about that. I've never been, sort of been an agnostic on Webb. Webb has a tremendous power to divide Democrats and liberals, with some thinking, he's that kind of tough-minded populist who's the greatest thing that ever happened to the party, and others thinking, he has this, he's actually quite conservative. He has this, he carries handguns around. He has some record of kind of sexist remarks about women in the military. So very ambivalent relationship to him. But he certainly represented in many ways some of the, the kind of Democrat the kind of candidate the Democrats were looking for in 2006. He was able to win, in Virginia, which had been a very tough state for Democrats for a long time. And, his not running again, it's not surprising. I mean, people like Jim Webb don't like being United States senators, and they should know that beforehand. Not totally surprising, but it's kind of one more thing that represents, states like Virginia, and I think North Carolina as well, really kind of moving much more solidly back into the Republican camp. Which, I wrote my column in the current issue, the last issue of the Prospect about this. Really does represent, I think, a change where the Democratic Party will no longer have much of any interest in the South, which I think has a lot of consequences of its own.
Yeah, I can't say I'm surprised, just because, as you say, he never seemed to relish the role as U.S. Senator. One of the things I found extraordinary about that first race against George Allen was, one, how poorly George Allen ran. I was a big George Allen fan. I thought he was very impressive as governor, and it was just a horrid campaign from beginning to end. And another thing that amazed me about that race was that Jim Webb was able to portray himself as a nicer, more pleasant guy than George Allen. And one of my favorite moments was in a typical desperation, last-minute attack. George Allen pulled out various offensive passages from Jim Webb's novels. And I remember it was an event at Charlottesville where Jim Webb was standing there, and I think Mark Warner and others were in the background looking as uncomfortable as I've ever seen any politicians look, reading reviews of his books to prove what a serious author he was. But I mean, he's obviously a brilliant guy, a fascinating guy. And I would think, from my perspective, a healthy influence to have within the Democratic Party, but maybe we're just seeing that tendency disappear.
Well, I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, there aren't many people like Jim Webb, so it's hard to sort of extract a tendency out of it. But that may be. I mean, it comes a couple days after the announcement that the Democratic Leadership Council was closing up shop, which has brought out a lot of interesting reactions as well. Although it's kind of like reading the obituary of somebody who dies at 110. You're not really. It's not like an untimely demise, because in many ways that organization has been pretty irrelevant for a long time. But to me, the DLC, a lot of people on the left talk about the DLC as if it's just, as if it represents the corporate, Ben Smith and Politico quoted a bunch of people calling it, the corporatist wing of the Democratic Party, which it had some element of. But to me, what the DLC was always about was, a deep commitment to, a deep belief that a Democratic Party that doesn't have a lot of support from white Southern voters is doomed. And it's because its founders came out of that tradition. A lot of the early activists were people like Bill Clinton or Lawton Childs or folks like that, and somebody like Webb fit well in that tradition. I think that the reality is, it actually is possible for a Democratic Party to exist without the South and certainly without white voters in the South, and that's a very different reality than at the founding of the DLC in 1984 or 1985.
Yeah, I would argue that there's still a need for liberal Democrats to practice a certain kind of defensive politics that Bill Clinton was always very cognizant of. And I think in the euphoria of 2008, that was something that was forgotten. It was important that Bill Clinton was always seen going to church carrying a big, thick Bible, just because people tend to have the image of liberals as these wild-eyed secularists that don't identify with the values of most Americans. And that was an important aspect of Democratic politics that I think was forgotten, that now Barack Obama is, to some extent, trying to revive. And I think also, obviously, just the
it would be nice, if I can interrupt for just
Sure.
a second.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be, as you say that, it'd be nice if every once in a while one of these Republican presidents would go to church once in a while.
Yeah, well, but
if
but
that's such an important thing to do. I mean, I'm not particularly concerned about it, but if it's so important, I'd like to see them there.
Well, look, I'm a Christian, so I think it's important for everyone, but it's not as important for Republicans because there's not that stereotype about them. So, I mean,
Right.
this is just the nature of politics, right? Democrats can cut or save $500 billion out of Medicare as part of the health care legislation, and there's barely a peep, from anyone about it. Well, Republicans
except for
squawked a
Republicans,
lot.
yeah.
But if Republicans were to do that, the firestorm would have been magnified by several orders of magnitude, just because everyone's kind of primed to believe that Republicans want to cut the hell out of Medicare, and a lot of them do. So that's an area where Republicans have to tread very carefully and play a sort of defensive politics. So this works for both sides, just in different areas.
Right. Well, it made me think about, I don't know, one of the things, I feel like this topic is a little exhausted, but I was really interested in the whole drama of the tributes to Ronald Reagan and the ways in which the enormous the degree to which it became a national celebration, and the way that, as somebody pointed out, the 100th birthday of Franklin Roosevelt, which occurred kind of in the depths of the 1982 recession, kind of passed without any notice whatsoever. So it's interesting that the importance of that to conservatives, but it also made, one of the many things that I thought about that, and I'm a little bit soft on Reagan, but as liberals go, but a lot of what made Reagan successful was the fact that there were a lot of Democrats who were enormously cooperative with him, which ranged from, the conservative Southern ball-weevil Democrats, many of whom later became Republicans, but even up to people like Tip O'Neill, who had a great political spirit of, we'll fight him one day, and then we'll sit down and we'll work something out, and then we'll go back to it. And that's, it was a kind of politics that we're just not practicing at all, not even close to. And that's kind of raised, I guess what reminded me of that was, the question of, is in the euphoria of 2008, did Democrats, the Republican contention, I think, is Democrats forgot that they needed to deal with this Republican Party. And my view would be, Republicans forgot that they maybe should try to behave like Democrats did in the 1980s, which is, fight like hell and then get in the game and figure out what's a reasonable middle.
Yeah, I would imagine, though, when Democrats actually sat down to deal in the 80s, or when they went along with certain Reagan initiatives, fear played a big role in it. I would imagine, especially with those boll-weevil Democrats going along with the first tax cut, and they weren't just cooperating out of the goodness of their heart for the sake of cooperation. they went along with the program because they thought it was popular, and maybe even they thought it was correct.
Well, a lot of them thought it was correct. I mean, those people included people like Phil Gramm, who were Democrats.
Correct,
so
right.
They definitely thought it was correct.
Yeah.
But
Well,
I'm more thinking of people. I'm more thinking of things like the tax reform of '86, or and there were also lots of ways in which the Reagan White House met them halfway. I mean, there were lots of budget summits, and there were lots of the tax increases in 1982 that certainly complicate Reagan's legacy for conservatives.
Well, one of the things that's been very irritating to us on the right is what we consider kind of the body snatching that's been going on with regard to Reagan, which in the broad scheme of things is very heartening. I mean, one, because it shows his ascension to the pantheon of great American presidents that everyone wants to stake a claim to. Two, it just shows how the last 30 years the center of American politics has moved to the right, that you can even have liberals saying any sort of kind things about Ronald Reagan is extraordinary, let alone some of them, trying to almost claim them as one of their own. Here was this guy who raised taxes and negotiated with the Soviets, and
right.
He wouldn't even be considered a conservative today, which I think is really an absurd claim. I mean, what I think some liberals are focusing on is a simple fact that when you're the President of the United States and you're a statesman, you're going to have to compromise on certain things. You're going to have to engage in kind of prudential politics, and you can't get 100% of what you want. And I think that's true of anyone in office. That really doesn't tell us very much about how conservative he was. It just tells us he was a statesman. But if you look at his North Stars, they were always the ultimate goal. Ultimate goals were always very conservative, and they stayed the same really throughout his career.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think the liberal body snatching is. I don't know anybody who really wants to claim him as a liberal president, but I think it is worth pointing out that he had a kind of freedom of action that obviously conservatives like Bob Bennett and Charlie Crist, for example, in the modern Republican Party haven't had within his own party. As well as a full engagement with both the circumstances and the political dynamic of his time. But I mean, I think for a lot of liberals, that idea that you have somebody who has a North Star at a time when a lot of Democrats didn't seem to have much of a North Star at all, in a way, parsing out when Barack Obama said in the 2008 campaign and later when he talked about admiring Reagan, sort of the safe explanation of that is to say, well, I just admired somebody, because he had that, he had an ideology, he knew where he wanted to go, and that allowed him to figure out different ways to, as you say, be a statesman and figure out how to get there. He had that North Star, which I think is a useful corrective when you have a lot of politicians who don't seem to have that sense of it. So it's sort of like, it's more like I like the antimatter universe Reagan, or the guns, I can't remember it's like a comic book phrase that I'm trying to come up with. The opposite world Reagan.
Right.
But I think there's also I always think about this as somebody who was in college about the same time as President Obama or whatever. There's sort of a generational experience there, I think, where you start out, you're a kid in college, you think, my God, Ronald Reagan's just been elected. This has to be the worst thing that ever happened. and then you kind of come of age in that presidency, and you sort of by the end of it, you think there's some horrible things there. I don't like Justice Scalia on the Supreme Court. I don't like the Iran-Contra scandal. There's lots of things you don't like, deeply don't like. But ultimately, it feels like there's a kind of normal process of American politics, and some aspects of conservatism were actually useful correctives to some things that you begin to understand were sort of the excess of liberalism. That's where I've always thought, in many ways, where somebody like Obama was coming from, and it's kind of like if the American political system were to move back and forth between arrangements more or less like Reagan in the middle part of his 8 years, and Obama now and in the last few years. I mean, that would be a sort of reasonable oscillation, which I don't think we quite have right now. That's sort of the soft liberal view, I guess, of it.
Yeah, well, let me take on a couple of those. But just first of all, let me register my strong dissent mentioning the names Charlie Crist and Bob Bennett anywhere in proximity to the name Ronald Reagan, especially Charlie Crist, who's utterly without principle and just one of the great political cynics of our age, I believe. Ambition was everything to that guy, and he had no principles whatsoever.
Well, it didn't work out very well for him.
No, it didn't, thank God. And Bob Bennett, slightly different case, but, a guy, I don't know why these guys feel as though they've been in the Senate 30 years and they're entitled to be there forevermore. Mm-hmm. And there are lots of, I'm sure, primary challenges in the 1980s from various candidates from the right as well. So this really isn't a new phenomenon. I thought, though...
I don't think so. I don't think you can come up with too many primary challenges from the far right to generally conservative Republicans. I'm not even sure you can find many to liberal Republicans.
I would imagine, there was Nick PAC, which everyone demonized as this far-right outfit that was destroying our politics. But I do not have off the top of my head, though, examples. But I think also here you have to distinguish between what are going to be the kind of mores and habits of a parliamentary opposition as opposed to someone who's actually elected president of the United States. So I think there's a little bit of an apples and oranges problem there. And this brings me to what I thought was really, I don't know whether you got a chance to read it, a fascinating and very shrewd inaugural maiden speech on the Senate floor by Rand Paul, where he took the two Clays, Henry Clay and Cassius Clay, and says, I'm going to be like Cassius Clay, and like the abolitionist, and he wasn't comparing himself morally to the abolitionist, but comparing himself to their role, which was overwhelmingly as outside agitators, and oftentimes very unreasonable. Burning the Constitution and calling it a pact with the devil. Now that was a very important element in the debate that helped move the center of gravity of public opinion towards abolitionism on the issue of slavery. But that didn't mean at the same time you still didn't need an Abraham Lincoln, who was very cautious, very hesitant, who was always, sticking his foot out to make sure the ice was firm under it before stepping out. So I think you need both elements of that. I think both elements of that were present in the 1980s. It's not as though Ronald Reagan didn't have plenty of critics from the right at the time. So I think now, without a presidential candidate, without a president, you sort of see that kind of outsider Rand Paul element predominating.
Right. So he was essentially denouncing Henry Clay and taking on the mantle of, the first Cassius Clay, the original Cassius, the abolitionist.
Correct. Yeah.
Well,
it was a little hard on Henry Clay because the Compromise of 1850 was deeply flawed in many ways, but it did at least give the North 10 more years to gather its strength, which was a key element, I think, ultimately in winning the Civil War.
Well, and for me to be sympathetic to that, you have to think of the world as one in which there are policy choices going on that call for the sort of moral commitment that is comparable to the abolitionists. Now, I know that a lot of people who are pro-life take on that mantle of the abolitionists, and I don't want to get deeply into that debate. For Paul, it's a whole set of other things that I can't see. I could see you can have any kind of debate about what sort of health care structure you want in the United States. Whatever it is, it's going to involve some complex mix of public, private incentives, a lot of stuff. It's not slavery, it's not. And so to take on the mantle of the abolitionist with regard to Barack Obama's economic policy or his healthcare policy or whatnot, that's just not an accurate way to think. It's not a useful way to think about the world, and it's not a useful way to participate in democracy when you've been elected, to represent the people of Kentucky. I'll read the speech, and maybe I'll feel differently.
Well, he does. He has a line in there saying, "I am not saying we have any issue in our politics of comparable moral import to
that's
slavery.
reassuring.
Certainly not the fiscal issues." But
Right.
I think his basic point is sound. You don't need everyone in our politics to be consumed with the art of compromise and how you sit around a table and split the difference on things. I mean, you clearly need voices of principle who are advancing an argument explicitly to push the envelope their way on issues, as Paul is committed to doing on the debt and the size of government. So Republicans are never going to, anytime soon, adopt his plan to cut $500 billion in this fiscal year, but it creates a useful pressure to make sure that they at least follow through on the promises they've made and maybe think about going further. So I salute Rand Paul.
Right. Well, and obviously, I think everybody has there's a kind of political personality that each of us have, and any of us would fall into, I definitely don't have the Rand Paul personality. On the left, and there are people who do. I don't have the Paul Wellstone personality. There are people who view that as that's their role, and there are always senators who operate in that role, and it's not a crazy. There are times when it's a super useful role to play, because if everybody kind of falls into the mold of here's what we're all doing now, then you're exactly like the Henry Clay and just about everybody else who thought, well, the best you might be able to do about slavery is the colonization plan or something like that. And obviously that role is important. It's also very, very important from the outside, and people have a different personality to it. I do think that strain runs very deep in the Republican Party right now, and the subtle distinction you're making between the sort of there's a season for everything kind of distinction that you're making may be lost on a lot of the Republican activists. Although it'll be interesting how it plays out in the presidential primaries, where certainly from what I'm reading, there's a kind of a declaration that an awful lot of candidates are kind of disqualified for one reason or another for kind of not playing that Rand Paul role. Mitt Romney's disqualified because of Romney Care. John Huntsman's disqualified because he went to work for Obama. There's the list gets narrower, the field gets narrower and narrower until it's just Gingrich and Palin.
Well, I would make one more point, Mark. I don't think it's just a matter of what your personality is and kind of your affect on these issues. I think it's oftentimes the case that just splitting something 50-50 is not the right answer. If you go to one of the great motivating issues, obviously, of Ronald Reagan and his administration, it would have been wrong just to sort of split the difference with the Soviet Union, right? It was correct to have a maximalist view that we're going to drive these people into the dustbin of history and defeat them, period, end of story, no compromise. Now, how we go about that will have to be tactically shrewd, and sometimes we're not going to negotiate, sometimes we are. Sometimes we'll reject arms control agreements, sometimes we'll accept them, depending. Mm-hmm. But that's all tactics in the cause of advancing what is really 100% view, and it's not splitting the difference. So, it very well may be that Rand Paul is correct, that splitting the difference between Paul Ryan and Barack Obama on the budget is not enough, and you have to go much further.
Right. Well, I don't think the Republicans are willing to even start from the Paul Ryan position, so that's, because of the political consequences of that. Nor do I think I think that is a dramatic oversimplification of Reagan. There are times when you can talk about Reagan as having maximalist language. There was also kind of, it's hard to believe that Reagan didn't, when he was, at the time of the arms control agreements and things like that, that he didn't basically think the Soviet Union was going to be around for a long time and have actually a vision of the two countries coexisting without nuclear weapons. Tear down this wall was about as maximalist as he got, and there wasn't a lot of action put behind that. So I think that's, that to me is the great overreading of Reagan. No, I mean there was a North Star. Obviously he wasn't a Kissingerian realist that really almost doesn't really want to mess with change in any form. There was a willingness to kind of shake up some assumptions about foreign policy, but I don't think he was I don't think the guiding principle of his foreign policy was the elimination of the Soviet Union.
Oh, no, it was. I mean, he really wanted to destroy communism as a system. I mean, there's a famous quote he told one of his national security advisors, asked him, what's your strategy with regard to the Soviet Union? We win, they lose. Mm-hmm. And you look back at the various strategy documents the administration crafted, they were all in pursuit of the ultimate goal of driving the Soviets out of existence, primarily because they couldn't keep up economically. So again, this was a hugely ambitious, 100% strategic goal that was pursued with tactical shrewdness. And to me, that's just the definition of statesmanship. You set the goal, and then you maneuver your way there. And I think liberals like to focus on all the maneuverings because, look, eventually he sat down with Mikhail Gorbachev, but that was only because he thought he was a guy we could work with, that we had the upper hand militarily and economically, and they were at a point of weakness where we could really drive our advantage. So it wasn't negotiating for its own sake. It was negotiating in pursuit of the ultimate goal, which of course came to fruition, and most people on the left poo-pooed and said was impossible until it happened, and then it was inevitable.
Right. Well, I mean, I don't. Obviously, I mean, those. This is a little bit. This is sort of an area of history that I know less about than the domestic policy issues. I mean, I think they're obviously you can focus on the tactics, or you can focus on the ultimate goal. If the ultimate goal was the destruction through economic, crackdown, there were other ways to do that. And obviously, I mean, Reagan and Jeane Kirkpatrick and others. I mean, they did more than another president at the same time would have done, both wisely and unwisely, and legally and illegally, to kind of continue the Cold War. But Reagan also moved fairly dramatically to get to that bargaining table, and I don't think that was solely because he had, he had a vision of, I can crush them at the bargaining table and make them give up their last advantage, but because he actually had a vision of, I mean, I think it's well established that he had a vision of the possibility of a nuclear-free world in which the two countries existed. I mean, there was there was a deeply moral vision there, and that's to me that's where a lot of the respect for Reagan does come from, because when the alternative is kind of Kissingerian realism, there's a real place for that alternative, for that vision that sees the possibility of a different world other than the current balance of power.
Right, correct.
And that, of course, is relevant to talking about Egypt right now, but I don't know, I just think it takes it a little too far.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Moral imagination is a huge part of statesmanship, and Reagan did represent kind of a yeasty mix. It wasn't just 100% doctrinaire conservatism, because his nuclear abolitionism, as you refer to, was deeply held, sincere, and appalled everyone around him who wanted to keep it under wraps. But just the last point, though, with Gorbachev, I mean, the key moment in those negotiations ultimately was Reagan saying no, because we are not going to give up SDI, and we've heard from former Soviet officials subsequently that was a key moment, because the Soviets realized that they couldn't keep up technologically, and they had to try to open their system gradually, and that led to the unraveling.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, it remains the fact that nobody in the establishment and nobody quite foresaw the unraveling.
Yeah. Well, there's also someone recalls I forget who cites this, but Reagan apparently, I think in the 1980 campaign, went to a editorial conference of the Washington Post and basically said this is his view. We're going to build up our military and we're going to bankrupt the Soviets because they're not going to keep up. And one of his aides, I forget whom, was just appalled afterwards, saying, you can't say that. You can't say it publicly. But it was really, it was his vision all along.
Okay. Well, I don't know if that's an interesting jump, I think, maybe to talking about Egypt a little bit, because I think that raises some of the same questions about the degree to which you're able to kind of use, I mean, it's not that our relationship is it's a very different kind of relationship, although it has its roots in the Cold War as well. But it raises that question of whether you're able to imagine a different future, or whether you sort of fall back in the assumption that the stable status quo of Mubarak is probably in the best interest of the United States. I don't know. You said you want to talk about Egypt a little bit.
Yeah, well, I tend to fall back on the stability argument a little bit here. I think the Soviets or the Iranian regime, you would push the accelerator in every way you can to force and support change. Egypt, I think, is a little trickier question because they are an ally of the United States, and I think the fact that 5 different presidents dealt with Mubarak tells us a little something about the kind of just the inherent forces pulling us in that direction. And it's definitely true, as Jackson Deal, the Washington Post, and others have been writing. In retrospect, we should have been doing more to support elements of Egyptian civil society that would have created a stronger, hopefully more secular, more moderate opposition to Mubarak, so he wouldn't just be able to point always to the Muslim Brotherhood as the boogeyman. But no one really did it. Even President George W. Bush didn't do it, and this was explicitly his policy to do it, which just shows that there are always other countervailing interests that were considered more important, and those were really important interests, whether it was cooperating in the war on terror, or at the end of the Bush administration and the current Obama administration participating in the peace process, which I thought was kind of a misbegotten policy, but both administrations considered it important. So anyway, this is a long way of saying I would be. I don't think we can be seen as aiding and abetting and supporting a crackdown by any means. I think we basically have to be on the side of the protesters, but we really have to have a clear-eyed view here and support gradual change to the extent that's possible. I think it's a mistake to rush to presidential elections. I would consider the election scheduled in the fall in these circumstances, even that, a rush. So I would hope we could push the regime into agreeing on a timetable for changes, and the first change would be proposed changes to the Constitution that are then voted on by the Egyptian public, and then subsequent to that, after some period of time, you have parliamentary elections, and subsequent to that, some period of time, you have presidential elections. But one of the signature failures of the Bush administration, especially with regard to the Palestinians, was just rushing to elections in a political culture that wasn't ready for it, and in a political culture that had a crucial player, and when it came to Palestinians, Hamas, that wasn't really democratic, and that wasn't, that was basically an armed militia and was not willing to play by democratic rules. So that's an outcome we have to avoid at all costs in Egypt.
Right. Well, I mean, I think we had a lot more to say about the timing of Palestinian elections than we have about the timing of transition in Egypt. I mean, when it's time to go, it's time to go. And if we're propping up, the Mubarak regime for another 7 months, that certainly puts us, on the wrong side of history, whatever the right side turns out to be. So, I mean, that seems to me to put us once again in a position in the Arab world where we don't really want to be. And I don't know. I don't know what comes next. I mean, I'm one of those people who's kind of influenced by seeing Turkey move in a direction where they're saying, we actually are able to live with a certain Islamist influence in our government and in our politics, without, we don't have to in the way that they classically did from the time of Ataturk up through the last decade, that we don't have to put up every possible wall to make sure that it's a secular state and all Islamist influence remains on the outside. I mean, it is possible to have a civil society that involves that tendency, and even the Muslim Brotherhood looks a lot more benign, as we see it up closer, than what we were kind of led to think it was. I mean, it looks like the Elks Club, as far as I can tell.
Well, not any Elks Club like I've ever had.
I mean, it's an older. Basically, my point just being it's sort of an older group of it's just a very different cultural impulse than what's driving the younger generation that are at the vanguard. And in a way, you might want to rush towards resolution of this at the time that younger generation is still in the vanguard, before the older opposition kind of consolidates around, kind of wraps their arms around it.
Well, I think the problem, though, is no one else is really organized besides the Muslim Brotherhood. So I think the best argument against basically acceding to the existence of the current regime minus Mubarak is that if the revolution is seen to fail, I don't think there's much short-term risk there. We'll end up with a government more or less like the one we've been dealing with for 30 years. But I think in the medium or long term, there is a big risk there, because when inevitably the discontent bubbles up again, you're going to have people saying, well, look, we tried basically a peaceful way last time, and it didn't work, so now more extreme measures are called for. I've heard people make comparisons with Russia, the failed 1905 revolution, and how did that feed into the 1917 revolution, which obviously went disastrously wrong. But these protesters, I think, have been amazing. I mean, they have been self-policing their own protests in a way that's quite extraordinary. They've been very peaceful, very moving. But the danger, in my mind, is being impatient with the political process in a way that lets it slip into the Brotherhood's hands. And it just makes me very nervous when there's an Islamist movement like that, and everyone starts talking about its moderate wing, or we can really deal with them and how reasonable they are. I know there's a very sophisticated argument that Raoul Garecht, formerly of the American Enterprise Institute, makes, that if you're going to moderate Islamism over time, you need to get it into a democratic process, and you need to give it some power, and that will make it more responsible over time. It's just that is a huge risk, and there's an argument people make about Turkey that it's slipping out of the orbit of the West pretty much by the day, and and this hasn't been such a benign opening to an Islamic party.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I mean, I think that, like it or not, I mean, the alternative is kind of grasping, is kind of the United States becoming seen as, even more than it already was, the last defender of these
Right.
failed regimes, and out of a fear that if you open them up, one way or another, Islamism becomes a part of it, and then that our relationship with Israel becomes the driving factor of all these relationships. And at some point, I mean, I think we've always known, like that just was always going to become unsustainable at some point. And I mean, in the same way that I think to go back to the Reagan analogy, what Reagan was unafraid of, in a way that some people were afraid of was, what if you just kind of unleash ideas like tear down this wall? What if you really did just let it rip, and you don't know exactly how that's going to turn out. I mean, we see those we see most of the Eastern European revolutions now as turning out, fairly benignly, with some, aside from the Balkans, which was obviously going to unleash a lot of old turmoil. Other revolutions that started with moderates, whether it's Russia in 1905 or really Iran in 1979, didn't turn out. It didn't turn out that the original moderate opposition wound up in power. But to be unafraid to let that open up because you're so clinging to an unsustainable status quo isn't a position a country should be in.
Yeah. Well, just a couple things. I basically agree with that. Eastern Europe, though, a number of those countries had some past experience with parliamentary democracy, and they'd also, weirdly, although a totalitarian system in those Eastern European countries, there had been some openness prior to the fall. So you had well-established opposition leaders who are demonstrably liberal, and you had political parties forming. And the problem with what Mubarak has done, obviously, is he's kind of been sitting on all of that kind of ferment that you want to have, ideally, prior to the break with the old regime, so you have the political culture ready for it to take hold. But look, I basically agree we can't be seen as, as I said earlier, in any way implicitly backing a crackdown or to be enthusiastic about this new regime. I just think we have to be very careful, to the extent we can influence the situation, about crafting a political process going forward that's going to create as much safeguards against a brotherhood takeover or this going wrong as possible.
Right. I mean, obviously, you want to smooth, right. You don't just. I mean, in a way, hearing the protesters make Mubarak leaving their one and only goal,
right,
is a little scary, because obviously you want some thought to go into how you then rebuild the process after that.
Yeah, I mean, Mark, this is all easier said than done.
Yeah.
But I would think we'd want to. The reason why I would like Mubarak to go right away is because I think it buys you time for a longer running transition to presidential elections. I'd like to try to push that all out to the right. And then also, I think there's no reason the regime can't, if we can't have elections right now, why can't they, revoke the emergency law, open up the press, have the state media stop broadcasting, ridiculous lies? I mean, those are relatively easy changes that don't risk nasty or dangerously incompetent people taking charge immediately.
And just to go back to a point you made before, I mean, if you think, you said, obviously you do anything you can to support change in Iran and be much more cautious in Egypt. I mean, don't you think that in some ways seeing that change is possible in Egypt obviously has some influence on folks in Iran? I mean, obviously they're dealing with a different kind of government, and they're dealing with a different, there's huge differences between the two countries, and Iran is not an Arab country, but do you see those two things as completely separate?
No, I don't think they're completely separate, and to the extent that you have a region embracing democracy and having it work, it puts pressure on Iran and Syria, and those other regimes. But to me, the whole Egypt thing just puts, even in a more shameful light, President Obama's reaction to the Iranian protests, where I think he should have been much more forthright and vocal from the beginning in support of those protesters, and instead he was way too restrained because he had this fantastical vision that we were somehow going to sit down and negotiate, with the mullahs over their nuclear program, which is a fantasy I think is mostly been abandoned now. But
well, there was another very good argument. There was another very good argument, which was we wouldn't do those protesters any favors by having them be identified with the U.S. And they were not. It's not like they were calling for the U.S. to support them.
Well, some of them were, and I just think the history of these things, including going back to my obsession with Reagan, the Cold War, is he always speak up in favor of dissidents in these societies, always speak up in favor of people on the streets, always make the moral case that their demands are legitimate. And it doesn't create change overnight, but the regimes hate it because ultimately, legitimacy is the most powerful force in the universe. And I mean, this is why Mubarak is probably falling now, and he didn't 20 years ago, because he had a sort of legitimacy then, even if he wasn't a Jeffersonian Democrat, that he now lacks. And the fact that he has no legitimacy means he has to go, and he's going to go sooner rather than later. And we should just be doing everything we can to undermine the legitimacy of a regime like Iran's.
Right. I think that's fine, but I think it's a good case for that. What you talked about before of having a vision with where the tactics differ, and I think the tactics in Iran, where the United States conferring approval on something is the opposite of legitimacy, given the whole culture of that country for 30 years. Really, that's not the approach that's going to be most helpful in that particular circumstance. Even if, with all your heart, you want that revolution to succeed. I just don't see that. I just think it's it's just sort of the better part of valor to be thoughtful about the impact that endorsement would have had.
Mark, can we revert back to a domestic issue?
Yeah.
Because briefly, when you're talking about Rand Paul and Reagan and whatnot, you brought up 2012. So I thought I'd introduce into this conversation this piece I wrote the other day about Jeb Bush.
Oh, yeah. I forgot when you wanted to talk about Jeb Bush.
Yeah, so I was making the case. Jeb has said he's not going to run in 12, but he's open to it in 16, which I think if he ever wants to be president and feels a calling to run for president, that really has it totally backwards. Right. Because I think 2016 is going to be too late for him. He will have been out of office 10 years as governor of Florida. In 2016, you're really going to see this bumper crop of Republican talent that got elected in 09 and 10 and can't run now,
right,
but really ready to come onto the national stage. And I think some of the edge has been taken off of the Bush hatred, certainly compared to the last couple of years of W's administration. And I think to the extent it's going to be odd to have a third Bush trying to be a Republican president in a row, that's still going to be odd in 2016, assuming Obama is reelected. Just as odd then as it is now. Right. So to me, all the equities say, if you're at all interested in this and you want to be president of the United States, do it now and don't wait.
Right. Well, one of my kind of number one rules of politics is people who want to run for president should just run for president. And partly that's influenced by the fact that I worked for Senator Bill Bradley, who spent, several cycles trying to figure out when the right moment for him was, and maybe missed it, maybe didn't, but either way, that's, I sort of admire people like Obama who just, throw themselves in, and that didn't look like the wisest move back in 2006. You just do it, and if you lose, you lose. So I certainly agree with that. I'm not sure. I remember there's a book that came out in 06 or 07, which the basic focus of it was wrong. It was one of a couple books that talked about the Republican strategy to rule the country forever. Tom Edsel wrote one, and this was by a couple of LA Times reporters, Peter Walston and Tom Hamburger. I think it's called One Party Nation or One Party Country. There's actually a great... What's that?
Sorry, Mark. I was drinking and maybe made a sound. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Okay, no problem. No problem. There's a fascinating passage in there where they talk about the way in which Jeb Bush, the there was a reputation that Jeb Bush is actually the far better politician than George W. Bush, and that it was just kind of bad luck that Jeb fell down in the succession, as it were, because he lost the governor's race in 1994 unexpectedly, where George W. Bush unexpectedly beat Ann Richards in '94, and so kind of jumped over the better Bush, as it were, and Fred Lawrence has made that argument as well. You know, in this book, Wall Street Handbook, I make a good argument that, in fact, Jeb Bush was not that great a politician, and that W had a much more graceful way of dealing, particularly with the racial politics in Texas, which, you know, he really did quite well, and created a lot of allies around his education reforms than Jeb Bush had, rather clumsily. And of course, famously, somebody asked Jeb Bush what he was going to do for black people in Florida, and he said probably nothing. You know, the case is there's actually that maybe W was actually the better politician at the time. I'm not sure that I know the case for, you know, I'm still not, maybe it's just that for people who hate Charlie Crist and other people who followed in Florida, Jeb Bush looks like he was a great governor. I don't know. I don't know what's the positive case for Jeb Bush if his last name was Jones, you know.
Well, on education, I think they were 48th when he took over in terms of student achievement, and now, depending on who's counting, and there are all various ways to measure this, they're 3rd or 5th. So I think his education reforms are considered pretty successful, and you know, from my perspective, he was quite a successful limited government conservative. What I like about him really is I think he has a natural authority. I almost think that on the stage with Obama, he could make Obama look small, which is really hard to do with an incumbent president. Maybe I'm exaggerating Jeb's authority there, but you know, the Republican field at the moment, and this may be an artifact of the fact that fields of challengers to an incumbent always look small in comparison. But you know, I don't think it's knocking anyone's socks off. And my colleague Ramesh had a piece in our last issue sort of gaming out what a Mitt Romney-Sarah Palin fight would look like. And he paints a nightmarish scenario because he thinks it would really pressure the Republican Party along all its fault lines. So you'd have, you know, Romney, if he were to win, would surely come out of this race painted as a blue blood elitist who can't connect with the working class, and then have to turn around and try to connect with the working class. Whereas Sarah Palin would probably, in a race against Romney, you know, go maybe even more populist than she is now, which might make it really hard for her to win upper middle class voters in a general election. So I guess we're still in this phase on the right where we're all imagining potential candidates rather than thinking too hard about who are probably our real candidates are going to be. The other guy on my wish list is Chris Christie, but I don't think he's going to run either, just because he has real political risk. Because as soon as he evidenced the slightest interest in a national race, I could see his numbers plummeting in New Jersey and hurting the Republicans in the legislative elections coming up, and a hard time in the re-election. So
yeah, it's very hard to sustain the level of popularity as a Republican governor, you know, doing and the way he just sort of embraces trouble. It's really hard to see his numbers staying high for long anyway, which may be fine. I mean, you know, if you're going to be that kind of governor who sort of says, I'm not here to win a popularity contest, I'm here to do X, Y, Z, you know, if as long as you agree with X, Y, Z, then that's a way to govern, but it's not a way to get into the presidential race.
Yeah.
Although what do you think about like Thune or people like that?
My guess is that he's not going to run.
Yeah.
He seems a natural senatorial type, seems to like the Senate, and that's one irony, bringing us full circle back to talking about Virginia. You know, George Allen is running again. He didn't like the Senate. He was always very open about how much he didn't like being in the Senate.
Right.
But I guess being in the Senate is better than the alternative if you're just out of the Senate.
Right.
So I don't see Thune running. It wouldn't surprise me if Daniels ultimately doesn't pull the trigger. People say Barber is quite serious about it and talking to people seriously. But it could be quite a short field.
Yeah.
Romney, maybe Palin, but maybe not. I kind of don't see Huckabee running. Newt's definitely running. Santorum's definitely running. Maybe you get a Barber in there. But there was a lot of chatter in recent months about just how huge the field is going to be. I think the chances are it's going to be pretty small.
Right. But I can't imagine not. Romney just doesn't seem to click with anybody. He's just such a transparent fraud that I can't imagine if I were a Republican not wanting to jump into that field against Romney, even if I wasn't able to articulate an ideological difference with Romney.
Yeah,
that's why Huntsman, for Huntsman, it's sort of like, well, yeah, go for it, because you're at least a human being, not a robot.
Well, if you have any chance, this is the year to do it. Any hankering, this is the year to do it. You're tougher on Romney than I would be. We endorsed him last time. I think one of the problems he has, he's naturally fake seeming. So even when he's at his most sincere, and this is going back to Ramesh's thesis, I think Romney and Palin are just polar opposites in almost every way. Because she's a gut instinct politician, and all of us on the outside are saying, study up, Governor Palin, learn your P's and Q's, and she has no interest in doing that. It's all instinct. Whereas Romney is analytical to a fault, and Romney just cannot bond with people. And of course, Palin has the base bonded to her like nobody's business. Palin would be great in Iowa, and that would be her great strength of her nominating strategy. Iowa's a disaster for Romney.
Right.
So again, they line up as kind of polar opposites in almost every way.
Well, I am harsh on, I know a lot of conservatives who have a whole brief against Romney for flip-flopping and inconsistency on issues. To me, it's like when Romney says, when they ask him about running for president, he says, well, my wife said to me, wouldn't it be great to have a president who really understands small business? To me, that's where I'm just, that's not how people who are married to each other talk to each other, and that's not what your wife said to you, And you didn't run a small business, you ran an investment firm. Maybe you had 30 employees, but you controlled billions and billions of dollars. So, it's just like he'll say, whatever, it's all scripted, it's all, and I just can't see people not, I can't see people, taking a hankering to that, and I don't see any evidence that they did. He won Michigan in 2008, but that's, other than that, there wasn't much of a click between him and either Republican primary voters or anybody else.
Yeah, again, you're tougher on him than I would be, and I would just, maybe we can conclude on this note.
Yeah.
You look at Romney and say, I don't see a plausible path to the nomination. There wasn't a plausible path to the nomination for John McCain either. He was not only a weak front runner, he was a front runner who had literally blown up his campaign.
Right.
There was no campaign left.
Right.
And
I wrote that obituary enough times myself, gleefully.
Yeah, well, and just happenstance, and maybe just this inherent migratory instinct of Republicans to back the person who's next in line, no matter what.
Right.
Kind of saved him. So I do not discount Romney at all, because ultimately it's going to come down to a race of alternatives, and everyone in the field at the moment has their flaws, and even Jeb, if somehow he were allow himself to be lobbied and urged into the race, he'd have a big flaw too, because there's no doubt that the Bush name is a problem, and a lot of the Tea Partiers have no interest in another Bush, because a big element of the reaction against the establishment in the Tea Party is anti-Bush.
Right.
So none of these guys are perfect. So that's why I don't think Romney should be discounted.
Okay, I hear you. I just want to add one thing, which is I think that
Sure.
A huge element of the Republican success in the last 2 years has been the ability to just move the Bush presidency into the past completely. So
Definitely
that
true.
Democrats Republicans were able to campaign against Jimmy Carter all through 1992. And that just wasn't allowed. That just didn't happen, which is, I think, a real achievement actually for a political party.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point.
All right, man.
So on that note of agreement.
Nice to talk to you as always.
All right. Thanks so much, Mark.
This is good. Okay. Bye bye.
Take care.